So I'm going to turn it over to Sasha here, and I want to do a brief little introduction. Sasha is a research meteorologist whose research focuses on interrelated aspects of weather, climate, and society, and his professional interests include understanding the links between regional weather extremes and large-scale climate variability and change, the atmospheric water cycle, fire weather, climate influence on society, and human influence on climate. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then I'm going to turn it over to him to go over the research.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see that? Can you all see that? Okay.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I am very interested in collaborating with teachers. My son is actually in 6th grade, and I am, well, my name is written Alexander, but it's pronounced Sasha because Sasha is a nickname for Alexander, where I come from. Place where they speak like this. Very large and very aggressive country. And if I tell you that I'm from the center of evil in the modern world, you can guess what city I'm from. Geographic and geopolitical question. And I'm not kidding about that. But anyways, I'm a meteorologist and a statistician by training, which means that I'm a climatologist, climate being the statistics of weather. And what I like to study are weather patterns, regional weather, extreme weather events, and how they related to climate variability and climate change, how to use those relationships to understand and predict things better, impactful things, experienced weather that actually has palpable impacts on society. And then we're also very interested in the impacts themselves. So we work with epidemiologists on the impacts of heat waves and smoke from wildfires on human health, impacts of extreme precipitation and drought and water resources and its management, marine layer clouds on ecosystems, and so on. And I'm lucky to work with this great group. We're all comrades, and everybody studies some aspect of weather and climate. And my job more and more is to connect all these different threads into manageable research thrusts, and also connect them to societal impacts. And we all do a lot of outreach and engagement work with decision makers, and I'm happy to be connected with educators. Let's see. It's not advancing. Oh, here we go. So yeah, we call ourselves WeClima, which stands for Weather Extremes and Climate Impacts Analytics. But I like it also because it kind of means we are climate, clima being climate in Spanish, actually. And these are the things that we study. And I'm going to go over some of the things that are highlighted in red: precipitation regimes and extremes. But I'm actually going to start with heat waves, and then go to precipitation regimes and atmospheric rivers, and a little bit about droughts and floods. But basically, I'll try to point out some impacts on society as we go along. But I'll start with heat waves, because heat waves, among all weather extremes, are most directly connected to global climate change, most directly impacted by global climate change. So like any other extreme event, they're basically regional weather patterns with local impacts. But I hope to show you how they're related to climate change. And so, we know that the world has been warming. This is the instrumental record that started before 1880, but by 1880 there were enough thermometers out there to get a global picture of what the temperature was doing. And you can clearly see over these last 140 years, then the globe has been warming. It's warming actually at an accelerated rate. And of course, this is a globally averaged picture, so it's very smooth. When we look at California, temperatures averaged over California, we see the same picture. There's just more variability from year to year because we're averaging over a smaller region. That's just statistics. A smaller sample means more variability. And if we break this down into maximum temperatures, so these are daytime maximum temperatures that typically occur in the mid-afternoon, but not always, and minimum temperatures. Minimum temperatures typically occur right at sunrise because, there's cooling at night and the sun rises, well, then it starts warming into the day, typically. But then again, there are exceptions to that. And this is important to break down because, for one thing, maximum and minimum temperatures haven't been warming at the same rate. Minimum temperatures are warming at a faster rate than maximum temperatures, and that is reflected in heat wave activity. So on the right, we see a picture of heat wave activity over California now. It's basically summation of temperatures that exceed a high threshold, the 95th percentile of summertime temperatures. Basically, this is summing 5% of the hottest days over that threshold. And so this reflects both the intensity and the frequency of heat waves every summer, going back to 1979 in this case. And there are actually two time series in here, a red one and a blue one. The blue one is computed, heat wave activity basically estimated with nighttime or minimum temperatures, and the red one is the same index of daytime heat wave expressions estimated with daily daytime temperatures. And this is averaged over California, and you can see this even more accentuated kind of a accelerating increase in heat wave activity here. And what's really interesting are the colors, I think, because basically what they show is they highlight the differences between these two time series. When the red time series, the daytime expressions, daytime accentuated heat waves are relatively speaking greater than the nighttime expressions of heat waves, we color that difference red. And when the nighttime expressions of heat waves, relatively speaking, are greater than the daytime expressions, we cover that blue. And I say relatively speaking because heat waves are always hotter during the day, but sometimes it cools off very efficiently at night, and the nights are cool. Sometimes it doesn't, and the nights stay hot. So basically, those blue blue summers is when we've had nighttime accentuated heat wave activity, and you can pretty much see that. Traditionally, historically, heat waves have been mostly daytime accentuated in California, which is a semi-arid part of the world. Typically, there's it gets hot during the day, but then it cools off at night because we normally have dry conditions. But what we see lately is a spate of nighttime accentuated heat waves, and these are basically humid heat wave events, and it's really the water vapor in the atmosphere that's increasing during these heat wave events, nighttime accentuated heat wave events. It's related to the warming of the ocean, and you probably have all experienced hot conditions in the desert, It can get super hot during the day, then it cools off very quickly at night because the atmosphere is very dry over the desert typically, compared to some place like Mississippi, where it's very humid and it almost doesn't really cool off in any significant amount during the night. And that happens because humidity is the main greenhouse gas out there. It accounts for about 85% of greenhouse effect globally. So we've all noticed that in humid conditions, it just doesn't cool off that much. And that is actually a that is a really big deal, kind of a double whammy for health impacts. And here's an example of a heat wave, which was unprecedented at the time, the 2006 heat wave. You can see it on this time series. That's the one. If you can see my cursor, 2006 was a humid heat wave event, was unprecedented, and it had unprecedented health impacts in California, where 147 people died, according to coroner reports, due to hyperthermia, overheating. But really, other causes, if you add in all the other heat-related causes, it was more like 600 people that died because of that heat. I'm not going to get into heat and health impacts, because actually Tariq bin Marnia, my close colleague and comrade, is going to talk about this in a couple of weeks. But I'd like to just mention that I personally got interested in heat wave research because epidemiologists and public health professionals more generally were asking, why is this particular heat wave, the July 2006 heat wave, was so deadly in California? And that's when we started putting together these long-term heat wave indices. And we can, and we saw immediately back then that this 2006 event was unprecedented. It looked like it was, part of a trend, but it was a little early to tell. And so to answer the question whether it is or isn't part of the trend, back then we looked at climate models. And here's our results from one climate model that actually produces very realistic heat waves over this region. We did the same analysis. So here are the observations in the inset. Now they go a little bit further. They were updated. And then the same analysis performed in the climate model that is forced with increasing greenhouse gases, basically due to human activity. And, just like in the observations, typically, historically, we get these daytime accentuated dry heat waves with some rare exceptions. And then, at the end of this record, we get, two big unprecedented nighttime heat wave events, or summers with heat wave activity. And we can continue this experiment because we can continue forcing the model with increasing carbon dioxide emissions. And if we do that, of course, as the world, as the globe warms more and more, heat wave activity increases, just like everywhere else around the globe. It becomes more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting. But it also becomes humid and nighttime accentuated. So there's a double whammy here for health, because not only is it more difficult to cool down in humid conditions, it feels hotter, but it doesn't cool off at night. So you don't get that respite from humid heat as you do from dry heat. But again, Tariq is going to talk more about that. I'm just going to summarize about heat waves.
Sasha, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
On your previous slide, the units on the y-axis are days?
They're degrees, Celsius in this case. And basically,
okay,
it just reflects what these indices are. Like I tried to explain before, they're basically locally looking at temperatures that exceed a high threshold, the 95th, in this case, it's the 95th percentile. So it's basically the temperature at which at every station, and there were like about 100 stations across California, where summertime temperatures, daily temperatures, only 5% of the days go above that threshold. So, these are really warm conditions. And what that index is it looks at the days where temperatures exceed that threshold, and it just sums up those exceedances. So the temperature minus the threshold, and it sums that up over the whole summer. But then we do that locally at about 100 stations for the observations, there was 100 stations. For the model, it was a bunch of grid cells. But basically, then we average that together over California. We get this California average index. And so these are the temperatures. They're kind of like cooling degree days, in the energy sector. They use cooling degree days, which are basically degrees above a threshold that are summed up over a season. And it sort of is related to the demand for cooling. Same thing for heating degree days. You look at temperatures below a certain threshold, below which people start turning on the heater or the air conditioner in this case, right? So, but this is just a high threshold to look at the behavior, climate scale behavior of daily heat wave events over California. So that's what those are. And so to summarize, yeah, heat waves are definitely on the rise everywhere in the world. In California specifically, they're not only becoming more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting, like most other places around the world, but they're also becoming more humid. And we can expect that trend to continue. We've seen it continue. So I've shown you, when we started learning about this, we had data up to 2006. This has been updated through last summer. And you can see that, 2006 doesn't look as extreme anymore, but it certainly was. So we're going into extreme territory. Now I'm going to switch to something where maybe we haven't seen the trends quite so strongly as expressed in observations, but we're very confident about what to expect. And this is the hydroclimate, specifically precipitation regime, right? Rainstorms, rain and snow. And the precipitation regime here in this part of the world is extremely volatile. It's very variable from year to year. So we often, we almost never get our total annual average precipitation. We're usually way below, very dry, or way above, very wet, like we had last year, for example. And here's an example of that. In the winter 2017, which was one of the two wettest winters on record in California, we had the Oroville, Lake Oroville with Oroville Dam here almost overflowing. The spillway was actually damaged and this hillside began to erode. They evacuated 188 people downstream for fear of flooding, for fear of the dam actually failing. Luckily that didn't happen, but it was close. And then just a few years later, 3.5 years later, we have same lake, basically, reservoir. It's the second biggest reservoir in California. It was the level was so low that for the first time ever since the 60s, when this was constructed, they couldn't run the hydroelectric plant there and generate energy. So, okay, well, this was inserted by Alec.
Yep.
Maybe, Alec, you explain what that is.
Yeah, so one of the things that I am going to do, just as an FYI for everyone that's here, is that I'm going to edit your section, Sasha, into a polished research presentation video, and that's all that's the recording's being used for. So our dialogue right now and asking question and answers won't be in the video that gets disseminated. So just as an FYI a little bit. So this is an activity, if we had others here, that we would love to do with teachers. And actually, one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is, are you very familiar with understanding global change, out of curiosity? I'll
I'm
give
not sure
you a,
that I'm not sure that I'm 100% aware.
so understanding global change is something we've been running with workshops in our region, and we just ran one in September. And what it is it's a framework for supporting teachers working with students to explain complex phenomena on our planet. And it's a set of modeling practices too that can support students with making connections to why particular phenomena occur and how they occur. And what we were planning on doing is this was supposed to be a collaborative breakout session to try and explain the variability of California's hydroclimate. And I'm going to put a link in the chat right now to this Jamboard that we were going to do, but we're not going to do this activity, but it's one that can work with students very well. So, and as a good takeaway for you to use with your 7th and 8th grade students, if you're doing work on the water cycle. So this Jamboard that I just provided you a link to, you'll see in it that there are these icon cards. And Sasha, I'm going to start sharing my screen briefly, so I'll stop yours so that I can show this section.
I'll stop mine, yeah.
And then I think I'm sharing the correct screen, yes. And what's really nifty about it is that there are Jamboards and also an app. So you can actually drag these things called icon cards out onto this Earth scene. And you can use these to make connections to explain the phenomena of why California's hydroclimate is so variable. And if you want to see an example of what this looks like when someone has had the time and worked collaboratively to explain something like the water cycle, I'm going to drag and drop another link into the chat, which is going to be this one in a second, and I'll show it on my shared screen. So this is an example of what a model of on the Earth scene might look like with these icon cards. So it's a really helpful resource for supporting students with systems thinking and making sense of these complex phenomena. So I'm going to drag or I'm going to put this link into the chat for you. We're not going to do this activity right now because it's a collaborative one with lots of others. So, but it's a helpful resource for you if you're interested in doing this kind of work. And then I will announce when we have a future Climate Champions Design Summit. That's a 2-day in-person event where you learn about these modeling practices and how to use it with your students. Any questions about that?
I think I will have some once I go through this, because I'm thinking when I cover the water cycle is like very simple, but I mean very simple compared to all the elements that we can have in here if we are putting the changes on the climate that we're having in California.
Definitely. And, you know,
Very interesting.
this might be a little bit more like what you would see with your students, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
movement of water.
Just the
So
movement.
what's cool is that you don't have to provide all these. I provided these because this is for the teachers or students that have gotten to that phase to understand what some of those things are. So I copied and pasted ones that I thought were relevant to the discussion on like how California's precipitation varies so much. And I copied and pasted them into that Jamboard for the modeling, if that makes sense. So this is a tool that I'll provide you access to. In fact, you can make a copy of this Jamboard if you would like by clicking here and selecting make a copy, and then you can store it. But the great resource is right here, which is this page that I just shared with you on the water cycle. That is on the Understanding Global Change website. And you can always ask questions later about it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sasha so you can continue on. And then I will share those resources later with you. And then the recording, of course, will just be, I'll cut out that section. It'll just be your presentation, Sasha.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'll describe what's happening there in my own words. I think that's a great resource. So And this is all part of the water cycle, the global water cycle, which involves water evaporating from wet surfaces, mostly the oceans, and then moving around by the winds, typically very far away from where it was evaporated, and then condensing into clouds and falling as precipitation, rain and snow. A lot of it falls on the mountains, actually, more than on the plains and over the ocean. And then eventually it all runs down through various conduits, either surface flow or underground groundwater flow, but it eventually all returns to the ocean. It's like in the Old Testament was the first description, probably, or one of the first of the water cycle, where it says all streams run to the sea, and yet the sea is never full. From where the water comes, there it returns again. And this is a very concise description of the water cycle, but you can get into a lot of detail. We do that to understand what's really happening. It turns out that the water cycle, well, I mean, it's the lifeblood of the climate system. It makes all life possible on Earth. And yet we go about our routines without really noticing it that much or paying attention. Most of us. And what I'm going to talk about next is how this part of it, basically the precipitation over the mountains especially, is changing in California. And as we all know, most of our water in California comes from melting snow. At least most of our water that we actually use for farming during the growing season, and when we really need it the most, during hot summers when it doesn't rain in this Mediterranean climate. It rains in the wintertime. And we have this great natural reservoir called snowpack. Most of our engineered reservoirs are designed to capture that snow melt. That's what they're really designed to efficiently do. And the biggest precipitation events that we actually have are these weather features, storms, that are called atmospheric rivers. And they actually accomplish a lot of the water cycle, a lot of the movement from where the water evaporates, which is in the tropics and subtropics. And it's mostly brought in by the trade winds, into this tropical zone, the meteorological equator, the warm water over the Western Pacific. The tropics have an excess of water vapor. And then the mid-latitudes, and especially the high latitudes, have very little water vapor. And atmospheric circulation pretty much is a heat engine that transports heat and moisture. And moisture actually is also heat, because when it evaporates, it cools the surface down, just like when the sweat evaporates from our skin, it cools us down. And when it actually condenses into clouds back into liquid, it releases that heat that it took from the ocean when it evaporated, or from any surface that it evaporated from. And so that's part of how the water cycle is part of the energy cycle. It moves not only water but heat around too. And so a lot of the features that move the most water vapor, that accomplish the transport of water vapor from the tropics to the higher latitudes, are these atmospheric rivers. What we're looking at is a snapshot on a particular day from satellite of atmospheric water vapor content. And you can see these thin filaments. They're basically very humid and also windy conditions, like jets of moist air. There are about between 3 and 8 of them or so on any particular day around the globe. When one of these hits a coastline, especially a mountain coast with mountains perpendicular to the flow of these atmospheric rivers, then a lot of precipitation falls. It basically squeezed out of these atmospheric rivers, and we can see how a few atmospheric rivers that we get per year, these are not the most common storms, but they're the wettest ones. They provide about 50% of total annual precipitation in Northern California on the slopes of the Sierras and the transverse ranges. They're very orographic. It really takes mountains to squeeze precipitation out of these storms. Here's what a dynamic picture of one of these atmospheric rivers that actually occurred in 2019. There was a very active winter, February. Here's a bunch of water vapor that's slamming against the coast, and as it's forced to move over the mountains, it precipitates out. Well, these storms, atmospheric rivers, actually account for a heck of a lot of precipitation. And a lot of the time, very moist, extreme atmospheric rivers can produce as much precipitation or more than we get from hurricanes. Here's a picture of, basically a count of really extreme precipitation events where you get more than 15 inches of precipitation in 3 days or less. And of course, along the Gulf Coast, most of these events are associated with hurricanes, but in California, we get more than our share, and these are all associated with atmospheric rivers. You can see how tethered to the mountains those extreme precipitation events are. That's what one of those events looks like a few years ago in the Northern California River, the Yuba River. Also, because so much of our precipitation comes from just a few big storms, our precipitation regime is extremely variable. That's what this map on the left shows. It basically shows the variability of our typical variability from year to year around the mean or the average precipitation that we get. It's about, we typically expect to get like between 40 and 60% in Southern California of variance around the mean, around the average value, which, in San Diego, it's about 10 or 12 inches, so basically we expect to get anywhere between, let's say, I don't know, 5 inches and 17 or 20 inches. That's the kind of variability we get. It's very rare to actually get our annual mean precipitation. It almost never happens. The last time that happened was in 2016. But I don't think it happened any other year in this century so far. In other regions, it's a lot less variable, and that's because it rains most of the year. And so, because we get our precipitation from so few big storms, getting that 1 or 2 really big events or not getting them is the difference between a wet and a dry year. And I'm not going to get into all of these results, but I want to show this one that shows basically the summation of precipitation on the 5% of the wettest days of the year, and compare that to the variability of total annual precipitation. It basically, they're very closely correlated. So it's the extreme events that drive our hydroclimate here, how much water we actually get. And if we look at precipitation on all the other days, the 95% of the non-extreme days, it doesn't really explain the variability of year to year. And these events are the atmospheric rivers. Those 5%, the largest events, are atmospheric rivers. Here's what one of those looks like on the ground in an actual river. This is the Russian River in Northern California, which floods often because of atmospheric river rainfall. And here, actually, what we're going to see is this event on the right, February 2019. This is just as the atmospheric river is beginning to produce precipitation, it's just beginning to rain. Here's what the river looks like normally. And here's a series of 3 photos. The second photo, the next day, basically it rose that much. Notice this railing here. And the third day, the river basically breaks out of its banks and floods. So not surprisingly, a lot of the damages due to floods are due to atmospheric river events. And with climate change, we expect the intensity of atmospheric rivers, basically how much water vapor is moved by an atmospheric river, to increase. And the reason for that is because the amount of water vapor that can be held in the atmosphere, water vapor in its gas form, is related to temperature. It's exponentially related to temperature. So for every degree Celsius warming, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. And these atmospheric rivers are near saturated conditions. So they're near what the limit that the atmosphere can hold. So as it warms, then the atmospheric rivers become wetter. And when you slam more moisture against the same mountains that are not moving anywhere on those time scales, well, more of that comes out. And so we expect to get more precipitation out of these extreme atmospheric river events, and actually less from other storms. And so what we're seeing in climate model projections is less frequent precipitation, but more extreme extremes. And so the total amount becomes even more dependent on those 1, 2, 3 really big atmospheric rivers during a year. These are wintertime phenomena. And because of that even greater reliance on extreme precipitation events in a warming climate, we expect the variability of year-to-year precipitation, our total amount that we get, to vary even more, to become even more volatile. And so for water resources, that basically means, if you boil it down, means that we need to learn how to generate water resources from flood water. And that's a challenge. So, and that is my story about why we expect our already great natural volatility, variability of the hydroclimate, of our annual total precipitation, to become even more variable in the future. Here's an installation that represents atmospheric rivers. It's actually called Atmospheric Rivers Globe. That's outside of our building here, and it's a result of a collaboration. It was made by an artist, Oscar Romo, a local artist who makes art from recycled, repurposed materials. So atmospheric moisture is made out of the bottoms of bottles that were actually found in the Tijuana River. And here's an atmospheric river falling on the coast of California. The contents are made of bicycle sprockets. So this is actually a collaboration between artists and scientists, where artists created original artwork that was motivated by scientific results. And I want to finish on basically telling you about this program that we're starting up here as part of an NSF project called COPE, Coasts and People. What we're beginning to do is install weather stations at schools. And this is the first one that we've installed in June. And this is Alexander Wayand, PhD student that is very much involved in this work, and my son Anton, who goes to this school. It's the San Diego French American School. It happens to be right on top of Mount Soledad, a perfect place to measure wind, moisture, radiation, basically to measure weather. It's the highest point in coastal San Diego County. and sometimes it's in a cloud when the coast is under a cloud. And we are looking forward to developing a collaboration with the science teachers there as a pilot that we want to spread to other schools, to basically integrate weather data into the science curriculum. And here's an example of the weather data collected by that station. It's only been there since June, so the only rain event that we had since then was a very unusual tropical storm in August, Tropical Storm Hillary. And you can see the pressure dropping as the cyclone comes over us, and then recovering again on August 20th. You can see the wind gusts picking up, and the wind directions changing as the storm comes through, and you can see the rain that's accumulated from it. And actually, you know, what was accumulated directly from the storm was up to here, but there were embedded convective cells in there that didn't impact every region, you know. So this basically impacted pretty much all of San Diego County, whereas the convective cells that were embedded in the storm only impacted, you know, specific localities. And over Mount Soledad, it actually, there was a rain burst in the evening that dumped actually most of the rain accumulated in that storm. I was sort of disappointed by the storm, happy that it wasn't as strong as expected. But then when this rain burst occurred, and it didn't rain quite as much where I live, but we heard the thunder and we saw the lightning, and when our roof started leaking, well, I wasn't disappointed anymore. So I'm just wrapping up with by saying that we want to collaborate with education professionals, with teachers, with schools, and we want to bring together the science, the art, the weather data, and education, into the school curriculum, and actually have students learn about the weather that they experience, but by doing so, learn about the physics, learn about data visualization, learn about statistics. So learn about the climate as well as the weather, and learn about the impacts on things that we care about, including public health. So this is these are 3 other installations that are part of the Scripps art collection, which is pretty much art that's inspired by science. And it helps us to explain, you know, how humanity impacts the global climate, and how that translates into very local, regional, and the most local of scales, the human scales. And in this case, this is a depiction of the impact of droughts and heat waves on our nature or Mother Nature. It's art, so you can interpret it in different ways. This is the impact of atmospheric rivers, floods, and sea level rise. And it's supposed to viscerally let us, you know, translate research results into